Kraken have been active. They acquire Oliver Bjorkstrand. We have Erica Ayala of Locked On Kraken to discuss that and all things Seattle Kraken as this team prepares for year 2.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome back to the Locked On NHL podcast. And thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Right now, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Seattle Kraken, Erica Ayala. Erica, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Gil. Always a pleasure to talk hockey with you.
Always great to talk hockey with you as well. And your team making a deal with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Oliver Bjorkstrand, 28 goals, 57 points last year. Does this move sort of signify that the Kraken may be looking to do a little bit more winning this year?
I hope so. I think there's still a long way for this roster to go. I think that we have to see how things play out when it comes to goaltending, which was a sore spot for the Seattle Kraken in the inaugural season. I personally would like to see a boon on the defensive side of things. That being said, I think this is a little bit different from some of the moves that we've seen in free agency. I'd say some of those were maybe like trying to close a gap type of contracts, 1 year here, getting a veteran on a 1 year contract. This is not that. This is a trade where we're using some of our assets, and I believe that there will be a future for Bjorkstrand, and we'll be able to balance out that pretty young roster, inexperienced roster that we have.
Who do you see them putting him on a line with when we start the season or when training camp opens up?
Yeah, it's been interesting to see some of the projected lines. And actually on today's show, on Monday's show of Locked On Kraken, spoke to the amazing Jay Foster about this. And a lot of people wondering if maybe we'll see Wright and Bjorkstrand together. I mean, obviously then we have to figure out another winger. But I think that, and I talked about this when it came to some of our other signings, there's a lot of potential here for the Seattle Kraken. I do think it's a matter of what's the balance between having a mature and stable line that's really going to crank points, which Bjorkstrand, obviously, we know can do that. And it's Jay's opinion that he was at, 28 goals this past season. He can be a 30 goal scorer for us. We certainly need that. So now it's about just that balance. We saw a lot of lines switching around with the Seattle Kraken. Some of that obviously with injury and of course the COVID absences. So I'm curious to see, but I think it could be fun if Shane Wright does make the jump and it's looking like all signs are indicating that the Kraken are expecting him to be on that NHL roster. I think it could be fun to see what Bjorkstrand could do with a Shane Wright.
And how much buzz is there around Shane Wright now surrounding this team?
There's a lot of buzz, and that's part of the reason why we've been talking about it on Locked On Kraken. But we've been talking about what are the free agency moves that the Kraken are going to make. And I think there were some names out there that, of course, you'd love to see associated with the Seattle Kraken, but they just didn't make sense anymore. Kadri being one of them. So the way that Shane Wright changed free agency for us is that now we have two young centermen in Beniers. That could be another pairing potentially for Bjorkstrand. But we see that we now have that centerman depth that a lot of NHL teams dream of. I know we've talked about that before. And of course, though that's still potential, we don't know what that's exactly going to look like or what the timeline truly will be for those two. So it's a little bit of a toss-up when it comes to how we can gauge this free agency, given that a lot of it is dependent on Matty Beniers and Shane Wright.
What about the goaltending situation? You mentioned it's an issue. How would you like to see them address this?
I think honestly, they've done what they can do. We have a new goaltending coach, and they have again some of those kind of just stopgap or or plug kind of contracts, and also we have to think about, and this is something that Ron Francis has been talking about, not only building, knowing that we have Chris Drieger out with injury until at least March with an ACL injury, but also knowing that we're going to have an AHL team. And so if you think about Joey Decord, who obviously was called up a handful of times, including right before the Checkers went on their playoff run, he's an option, but is he NHL ready? And Chris Drieger was in and out of the lineup. The guy just couldn't catch a break. I think Philip Grubauer, we talked about it a lot on Locked On Kraken, seems very just uncomfortable for whatever reason. Was it the system? Was it the newness of the team? Was he, did he have an ailment that was never disclosed? Couldn't ever really put my finger on the pulse. But again, there was a goalie change or goalie coach change. So that's indicative that the Seattle Kraken know that they want to make changes. We have Grubauer and Drieger on contract for the next handful of years here. So we can't make any massive, significant moves, at least not without some pretty massive, significant trades. So I think we're riding out what we have, again, building up some young talent. We saw that we took a goaltender in the draft, and so we'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to be. I think what I will say for this coming season is I think that a lot of it is still going to depend on how Philip Grubauer shows up for the Seattle Kraken.
So obviously, expansion teams usually, the Vegas Golden Knights being the exception that proves the rule, but they usually take a little while to get where they want to go. How much further along do you feel this team is now than they were at the end of last season?
We're a better team. I think anyone looking, at least on paper, so to speak, or on the web, right, on the internet, we can see that there were significant strides made. And a lot of that happens because of the assets collected at the trade deadline. I mean, this Oliver Bjorkstrand deal is one of those. We got the guy for a 3rd round and 4th round pick, and we still have 11 picks coming up in the next draft. So this is just what Ron Francis was able to do. So in that regard, we should be better. That being said, the Seattle Kraken were projected to do, I think, a lot more than they did last season. So now that's when you look on, again, what's on paper, air quotes for those listening on audio, what's on paper versus what Dave Haxtell and his staff can get this team to do. I think a lot of the things that we saw wrong with the Seattle Kraken was just they were small mistakes, losing focus in the middle of games, not playing a complete game, and that just can't happen anymore. That being said, some of these moves are veteran guys. Whether they stick around beyond the year or whatever the contract is, we'll see. But I think there's less of a tolerance for that type of thing when you look at some of the guys that we brought in.
All right. Steps forward for the Seattle Kraken. Erica, why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you as always, Gil, for having me on Locked On NHL. But you can find the Locked On Kraken show where we get more into this trade again with Jay Foster from Locked On Columbus Blue Jackets. You can find us at Locked On Kraken on all social media platforms. And make sure you subscribe to YouTube as well. We've got some fun nuggets over there. And you can find me at elindsay08. That's ELINDSAY08.
All right. Erica, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, the NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action. BetOnline, where the game starts.